Okay. Uh so we're at Mark chapter 3. Um uh I fear that this one will take two uh again. Maybe not, we'll see. Um Mark chapter 4 might be a three-parter. I'm not sure. That uh that chapter is very long. So we'll see about that. Um but last we left off, um Jesus was arguing with people about fasting, and then about the Sabbath. And remember that, like, originally, chapter divisions and verses and all that stuff were not there originally. And so sometimes things flow from like chapter to chapter. And so the next story is also having to do with the Sabbath, and it's a kind of progression on the last story. So let's.
Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him.
Okay. There's a lot here. So he's in basically the same town. But there's a lot of kind of different presuppositions here that various people are making. That's really interesting. So it says, and they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. So they have a couple of assumptions, right? They have a couple of assumptions that, one, Jesus can heal, right? That's a pretty big one, right? Um, Also that he's going to, also that it's somehow wrong to heal on the Sabbath, right? And so, like, if we don't kind of work those things out, it's going to sound really weird as to what is going on here. Um, um, so one of the things that I tried to like look up was that, like, okay, was it really, because I we talked about last week about how, like, Jews have this provision where, like, you're allowed to preserve life and save life on the Sabbath, which is exactly the thing that Jesus points to him here and goes, "Hey, is it shouldn't you be saving a life in on the Sabbath?" Um, and I ended up finding an article which I really appreciated because it was from a Jewish perspective, where he kind of talked about it, and he was trying to say, well, it was always um the tradition that it was okay to heal on the Sabbath. And I was like, really? Then where did the New Testament get this idea? And why would this even be a question for people? Because this showed up as a question for people like later on, and people had this idea that it counted as work. And he went on to the thing to say that actually, um, the Torah like specifically forbids like doing certain stuff. So I was like, man, you're really going back and forth on whether or not people are saying that this is okay or that it's not okay. But one of the quotes that I like from it, it says, a partial record of their debates. So the rabbinical debates about whether or not somebody could heal on the Sabbath in the first century is preserved in the pages of the New Testament, where Jesus justifies healing on the Sabbath day. But scholarly analysis shows that the arguments used to justify Sabbath healing, which are now attributed to Jesus, can be traced back to Jewish sources, even though they are not now recorded in any Jewish text. So I thought that was really interesting because, one, he's admitting that it's not now recorded in any Jewish text. So it's an assumption that Jesus got these ideas that
What?
The synagogue and
What?
he's making an assumption that Jesus got these from Jewish sources, and he goes on to quote those Jewish sources. So I did the thing, which you should always do, which is whenever someone quotes a source or like says, this person came up with this idea,
Assume that it's true.
you assume that's
Trust
true,
them implicitly.
or you go and you look it up. Just so you know, all of the people that he referenced lived after Jesus. One of them was born in 50 AD. Another one was born in 90 AD. The other one, we don't even know when he was born. He's just listed as a first century guy. And so literally,
It could have been like people born in 1999 like me. It's like, oh, I'm from the 90s.
well, exactly. The guy that was born in 90 AD is a first century
He's a
guy.
90s kid.
But it's like, okay. And also, we don't have any text from them, as he admitted. It's not written in any Jewish text, but they think that it probably came from him because they had some similar ideas. But those ideas, he goes on later in the article to say that those ideas get more clarified in second century text. And so I'm just like, okay, so now you're even further out from grace before anybody even says it. And also, if you look at the beginning of that quote, a partial record of their debates. Whose debates? The Jewish leaders at the time. Oh, so wait a minute. Jewish leaders at the time, there were some of them that were like, no, you can't heal on the Sabbath. That goes against it. So there's not this uniform idea out there that it was okay to heal on the Sabbath. There was some people that thought you could and some people that thought you couldn't. And because what's going on here is that the Jewish leaders at the time know that it's this questionable area. And so they're like, let's see if we can trip him up on it and use it to our advantage because we don't like what he's doing. So I always like it whenever you're able to find somebody that's like trying to argue against your position and you can read everything that they say and it's like, oh, this actually just confirms what I already knew. Like you actually didn't disprove anything that I thought about this situation. Okay. Couple of other things that could possibly be going on here. They expected Jesus to heal. This may show that they didn't think. So this is actually a really like kind of important point that these enemies of Jesus expected Jesus to heal. This shows that they didn't think miracles alone showed that somebody was like with God or on the side of God. The idea of a person being a miracle worker in that day and age would not have been synonymous with someone that was like a good person that was oriented towards God. And I think this is really important because certain Christians get this idea that like, oh, if Jesus made all these miracles happen or like came back today and was just doing miracles, everybody in the world would be a Christian. No, they wouldn't. Like there's like people who go around and like say that they're miracle workers, maybe even they do some kind of amazing thing or like whatever, but it doesn't prove what's like actually it doesn't actually validate that they are like on God's side. That's precisely why like Jesus combos his healings with the casting out of demons. It's those things together. Oh, hello.
I'm so sorry.
You're all right.
Thank you.
Introduced 10 minutes later.
Oh yeah, 10 minutes late. Yeah.
It's gonna be longer.
Oh, if I'm 15 minutes late, do you guys not have to show up?
Legally.
Legally. Okay. So my point is that in their minds and how they thought, performing the miracles probably showed that and because this is going to come up later, is right that the person was somehow that the person had some sort of power or was connected to some sort of authority, but they weren't really sure what the source of it was. So there's that. There's another thing that I want to point out here is that, again, this is the second instance of Jesus healing someone purely out of spite, right? Like the guy doesn't even ask to be healed. He just shows up and he has a withered hand. He doesn't ask to be healed. He doesn't cry out to anything. Jesus is just pissed at these other people and he's like, I'm going to heal them. So there's that. Another thing is that this sentence is awesome. I want to like, and he looked around with them at anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. We're going to take a little side tangent to dunk on Calvinists for a little bit here. Okay. Yeah. Okay. If you remember, whenever we were going through, because we didn't do Exodus, but like we talked about like a little bit of a lot of Calvinists like to go to the part in the Exodus story where it says that like God hardened Pharaoh's heart, right? And they're like, oh, see, that's God, like kind of like controlling like what he's doing. He's the one, God made his heart hard. Well, you literally have a sentence here where God is mad at people for them hardening their hearts. If God was the one that hardened their hearts, it kind of doesn't even make sense that he would be mad at them. So, like, that whole line of reasoning is blown up by that single sentence right there, which is that no, they are somehow like the Pharisees and the scribes are somehow like morally at fault for their own position on what they're trying to do. He's not setting them up to be foils to himself. Like they are that, and he's mad at them for that, and he wants them to stop that.
Not to defend the Calvinists.
Sure.
But I feel like because you're saying right now that God is literally mad at them for having hard hearts.
Well, Jesus is. It says he looked around at them with anger.
Yeah, right. I don't agree with that. You're spot on.
Yeah.
But you're saying too that they use the line in Exodus
Yes.
to say that God influences the wills,
Yes.
And so I guess I still, as a Calvinist for the next minute,
Sure.
I struggle to see how you can reconcile those two things because, the Bible says that God does the hardening of the heart.
Right.
And here, God is looking down on hard hearts. So,
Yes.
Obviously, there's stuff in Exodus that I'm missing. And as a matter of fact, I've wanted to ask you about that in the past because I've read that enough and been like, what's the deal there? I don't want to make this too much about Exodus.
Okay, maybe we haven't talked about it before, but okay, sure.
Yeah, I guess maybe I would need a little bit more as my Calvinist.
I feel like the real problem is from a Calvinist perspective, if like the actions like and the hardening of heart is due to God's influence, like why is Jesus mad? Like why is Jesus mad at anything happening ever? Because like that should be because of him necessarily. He should have some partial knowledge of that, or at least if he's at like okay, then you have a Trinitarian debate here and talk about what is Jesus actually privy to. But he should probably be at least be privy to the fact that acts are ordained by God, whatever it is that happens, if that's how it's supposed to work. So still, from an extended outlook on that perspective, he has no reason to be mad at anything really ever, because he's the one.
There's a couple things. One is that like, okay, so let's address this and then I'll get to your Exodus thing. So like one, I know what the Calvinist defense for this is. The Calvinist defense is that just because God like is sovereign and like caused them to like harden their hearts or whatever, he's still allowed to be like angry at them, which to me just doesn't like make sense. But like I've heard enough of them like say stuff along those lines that I'm like, okay, that seems to be like the way that they go on that sort of a deal. Is that like, oh, like they're still doing stuff wrong, and so like you can still like morally judge them. But also Calvinists are on a spectrum, so like they'll say different ones will say different things. So there you go. As for the Exodus thing, for the Pharaoh thing very specifically, to me, I think that the way that you should analyze that is you should look. So there's a couple things. One, is that you should look at the whole story, and there are instances like, because it doesn't just say one time that like God hardened Pharaoh's heart. It says it multiple times, and because it kind of happens after like each of like the different like plagues, right, and stuff. And I'd have to go back and look at it, but I think there's some of the times where it doesn't say that God hardened his heart. It says that Pharaoh hardened his heart.
Yeah.
And so like it goes back and forth. And then I think there are times even where like something occurs and Pharaoh's heart like isn't hardened, like because of like the different one. And so there's not this like straight progression. I'd have to go back and look at that because it's been a while. But regardless of that, to me, the thing that just like goes against it entirely is because on the Calvinist like worldview, right, of a strong determinism where God is sovereign and making everything happen, why does God need to harden Pharaoh's heart at all? Right? Like, why does he need to do an action at that point in time to actively like harden Pharaoh's heart? It implies that like that action implies that previously Pharaoh's heart wasn't hardened, and so like Pharaoh had some sort of free will, and then God stepped in and performed an action and like overrode it, or like it. You would need verses that said something along the lines of like God softened Pharaoh's heart, and then at this particular time Pharaoh like hardened it. It like it needs to be God controlling it all the way. But if God's only showing up at certain instances, what's going on all the other times? Well, at all the other times, we presume that he has free will. Like we does it all. Well, then there's free will, and then there isn't this hard determinism that you guys are all like saying is going on. And so to me, like it's like it's a verse and it's a story that like gets you about 30% of the way there of like confirming your worldview. But if you actually look at you, so this is going to be like a weird tangent.
Well, you're saying
it's almost the same way that I feel about the way that people take like evolution, right? Like they like whenever you hear anybody argue for evolution or like really do it, they'll show that like speciation and what's called microevolution is real, and they'll be like, therefore expanded out like to like millions of years, all forms of evolution that we say are true is actual true. And I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You got like 30% of the way, and then you just jumped like the rest. And the problem is like that the 30% that you did actually kind of counteracts all of the other stuff that you're saying, right? Because like, so like, it's going to be weird, but like, so like natural selection, right, is a selecting process of stuff that's already there, right? And so it's a removal of information, right? Because what you're doing is you're like, oh, we have all of these species that are these different colors. These species all die off. These are the ones that go on. Oh, that's a selecting. That's a removal of information. And so that shows change over time. But it doesn't show the generation of new information. But that's what you need to make the big thing work. And so your little thing actually disproves your big thing. That's your problem. And the same thing here. You have this little thing that kind of sort of gets you there to this hard determinism. But actually, whenever you think about it, the very act that God is doing undermines your big project that you say how the whole world works is that like from the beginning, God just like controls everything. And that's like the assumption that's made through everything. And so there is no free will. And so the whole thing like falls apart. Like as soon as you quote that verse, if you're saying that what that verse is saying is that it displays that God is controlling his actions, it implies that there was a time where God wasn't controlling his actions. And like that's the issue with that verse, if that makes sense.
So now with this Mark thing,
right,
we have Jesus looking down on their hardening of their hearts.
Yes.
And are we to perceive that as like, okay, that's a sin what they're doing?
Yeah.
So then, because the tough part that I'm at right now is like, okay, if they're sinning by doing that, why does God make Pharaoh sin, so to speak, by he hardens Pharaoh's heart? I know that's not what's happening, but like I gotta help me get there.
Yeah. So for that, what I would say is that you have to figure out the causation, right? And so whenever it's saying that, like, right, to how do you understand that verse in the view that I'm trying to say? In the view that I'm trying to say, the way that I would read that verse is whenever it says that God is hardening Pharaoh's heart, it's saying that like the actions that God is doing is hardening Pharaoh's heart. So like what he's doing is hardening Pharaoh's heart, and because that's the whole point. Because what is God doing? Yeah. God is doing all of these different plagues to undermine the theological structure of the Egyptians. He's dismantling the Egyptian gods' dominion and rule over these various areas that you go through, like all the plagues and stuff, which fundamentally undermines Pharaoh's position, because Pharaoh's position is the intermediary between the Egyptian pantheon and the people, which basically deifies himself, and he's the one that maintains order. The Egyptian words like ma'at. He maintains ma'at, and the display of his own ability to maintain ma'at is the fact that there is order in the universe and order in the Egyptian world. Like, you got to remember, Egypt became a powerhouse because of regular tidal flooding of the Nile and all of this stuff. And so they're a very ordered society. Why do you think they're doing pyramids everywhere and all this stuff, right? And so the fact that this dude shows up and he says, like, the Most High God above everything is going to smack you around, and like, if you don't let these people go, it's a big affront to him. And so what God is doing is hardening Pharaoh's heart. That's how I would take it, and that's how I would read it. And I think it makes sense of everything that's going on.
It might also be to some of the context of what hardening the hardening of the heart means in the different situations. I think obviously both instances speak to like a lack of empathy.
Yes.
For one.
And also, and like, I would even be willing to say that what Jesus is doing here is hardening the hearts of the Pharisees, right? Because in the same way, like, he's challenging their status. He's challenging the status, right? And we're going to get a line at the end of this, which I didn't even talk about, but we suddenly have this line about the Herodians are trying to, like, well, who are these people? They don't get mentioned much, but the Herodians are kind of explicitly a political group that were supporters of the Herod dynasty, that wanted the Jews to support the Herod dynasty and get closer and have closer relationship to the Romans. The Pharisees are a group that had that wanted people to, that they were like the religious leaders, and they wanted people to get to kind of, they were actually kind of trying to resist Rome and trying to get people back to this like hardcore understanding of Jewish teachings and to stop being so Hellenized, which is what the Herodians are trying to push people towards. And so you actually have two different power playing groups that are both feel like they're being threatened by what Jesus is doing. And so they end up working together to try and like go after Jesus. Sorry for interrupting.
But yeah, which is the context of I was about to say that that the hardening of heart that Pharaoh represents almost seems it is like a lack of empathy, but like in that instance, you can also almost say like it's his stubbornness is building.
Yeah.
Because I think like what it would mean for his heart to have not been hardened after any of the plagues, right, would have just been to say at any of them would have been like you can leave.
Yeah, exactly.
But instead, he's getting more stubborn in his position, and because of that, it is not allowing him to leave. That is showing a lack of empathy on one, but larger showing a stubbornness and ultimately leading to the rest of the plagues being necessary. Whereas in this case, it's first and primarily they're showing lack of empathy towards anyone that would actually be like the hypothetical situation that Jesus is putting before them is like, okay, it's kind of like the Samaritan story. Like if it was like the Sabbath and someone was dying out in front of you, you wouldn't do anything to help them.
Mhm.
And their response by their silence is essentially saying, yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
So it's really, and that's where like, okay, that's a slight differentiation about what it actually is, what the hardening of heart is referring to in this case. It's their lack of willingness to help someone versus like Pharaoh's stubbornness in I want to continue actively harming people. And
but they
are ultimately the same. You were right. You already brought up the similarities in them, and I agree with that too. But I was just saying some of the context is slightly different, as well as like, yeah, there is kind of like a hardening of heart already. But they already had it too.
You trying to say something?
Yeah, when he was finished, I had a comment. So for the hardening of the heart thing, I feel like this is a bit inspired. I don't know so much how I was taught it, but also kind of just how I interpret it, because like Diego said, obviously it looks like a contradiction if you're in just a straight read of it. So I've kind of felt like the whole like Pharaoh hardening his heart and then God hardening his heart, and maybe this is what you're saying, but I felt like a way that it's makes sense and maybe how it is that because Pharaoh was hardening his heart, and like because Pharaoh was like God knew that Pharaoh was just going to keep hardening his heart, and because Pharaoh was already in that place, then God just kind of hardened his heart. Either God just doing it because Pharaoh was already going to do it, or that's just the phrase they used in the same way in the New Testament, the phrases of like giving like the Holy Spirit will only strive for so long or whatever, and like God giving someone over to kind of the devil or whatever, and the church being told to like cast someone out for like a time and kind of give them over to their bad ways. So
Yeah.
that, and so I feel like it's a similar concept where
Yeah.
like God's, maybe he's not specifically like overriding his free will and causing him to sin. It's more like Pharaoh is choosing to sin and God's just handing him over to what Pharaoh is choosing to do.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
That's what that's basically how I would think about it.
Okay.
Right, because and again, to address the point of like, is God making Pharaoh sin? I feel like in a literary sense, you would like, they're both using hardness of heart, but in the one referring to Pharaoh, it's almost like, because I said I think it's the hardness of heart is reflecting his increased amount of stubbornness. Like a phrase we would say would be like, God caused him to like dig in his heels more. He was causing him to go further into his position because of God's actions.
Yes.
In this instance, it's more like directly your lack of willingness to help others is what's hindering Jesus.
And it's unwillingness to help others because you are trying to preserve your own status. Right. It's those things are connected. That Jesus is actually dealing with a lot of different status stuff in this chapter. It's going to show up at the end too. Like, it's not just that they're uncompassionate, it's that they're uncompassionate because they are trying to maintain their status. And so they are willing to sacrifice people. Like what you were saying, more like if they just found somebody on the road, would they leave them out there? They would leave them out there because they didn't want other people to see them helping them, because they wanted other people to see how devoted they were to upholding these Sabbath traditions. That's why they are using the very thing that Jesus and that God gave to them to be a help to humanity. They are using it to hurt people. That's why he's mad at them. And those things can't be divorced in what's going on here. And it's particularly why Jesus goes after the religious leaders so much more than he does the political leaders. They're both bad. Like the political leaders at the time, aren't good people, right? But the point is that political leaders are always bad. Like they're always terrible. The religious leaders are supposed to not be. And so that's why he's coming in and going, hey, this is a huge issue and it shouldn't be this way in my kingdom. And so I'm going to fix that. And even to what you said, Diego, about his actions cause God's actions causing people to sin. I would actually argue, and I would actually say that Paul kind of makes a similar argument actually in his letters, that even by writing the Torah, God kind of makes people sin. He's not causing their actions, but by writing the Torah and by writing those rules down, that's what makes people realize that they're sin. He has this whole thing where he goes back and forth where the Torah is a tutor, and what it's doing is that, and where he's people wouldn't even know that they are sinning, and so therefore they would be innocent because the Torah didn't exist. But because the Torah does exist, and because he's written these things down and people know about it, therefore they are sinning. And he actually ends up kind of calling that that's sort of how he sees the Torah, as a curse almost. It's a good thing, but it's a curse, because if people were just didn't know about it and it wasn't in the world, then they wouldn't be they would be innocent of those actions.
Kind of like the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden.
Kind of, right? He's making a very similar argument there. But what he's saying, but that still doesn't mean that they're he has other stuff about more natural law and all of this stuff. But just because God's doing that, he's doing that because he's trying to bring people out of their like they're still doing things wrong, and he's trying to bring people out of that, but he has to have a mechanism that solves that curse aspect of the law, and which is what Jesus is. And that's like Paul's whole big point is like this was a necessary thing that had to happen, that also had this downside, but God had to make that work and fix somehow. How did he do it? He made it work and fixed by Jesus, because Jesus solves that problem. So like, does that make sense? Like that's how I would see that thing functioning. And be my answer to someone be like, oh, God's making somebody sin. It's like, yes, but also no. Okay. Let's keep going.
Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea, and a great crowd followed from Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem and Idumea and from beyond the Jordan and from around Tyre and Sidon. When the great crowd heard all that he was doing, they came to him. And he told his disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd, lest they crush him. For he had healed many, so that all who had diseases pressed around him to touch him. And whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." And he strictly ordered them not to make him known.
Okay. So this little section, Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea. So remember, they're like in Capernaum, and so they're going into like the Sea of Galilee. You have this great crowd forming, coming from so Judea is in the south with Jerusalem, from beyond the Jordan. I don't actually know where Idumea is, but Tyre and Sidon are like northwest, right? So basically, it's people are coming from all over, and if you look at like Jesus's path in the Gospel of Mark, he's basically always kind of up in Capernaum, and then he makes like one trip down to Jerusalem, and like that's it. In the other Gospels, he's not doing that. He's like, he makes like multiple trips to, he's going to Jerusalem for like various feast days and all this stuff. And some of them, I think, like, I might have this wrong, but I think like in John, he even like, he shows up to like one of the feast days like late, because like he doesn't want to like draw a crowd and all this stuff. But then he goes to the temple and is like doing all, and like his teaching and all that stuff. Like he's all over the place in a lot of the other Gospels. And this one, he just is kind of just like one trip from like up to down. But to me, it seems like this here is kind of like, it's kind of serving almost like a little bit of a summary, because if you've been paying attention to what how Mark has been laying out the gospel so far, he's like, Jesus does this and this and this and this, and it's all these things, and here are a bunch of controversies that are going on, and here are the people that are like against each other and all this stuff. But it's always like Jesus preached, and blah 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 blah. But remember how I was like, it doesn't ever say like what Jesus preached or like what he was doing. Like mostly he's just been like arguing with people, he's been healing people, casting out demons and everything. But like there hasn't been any of like what he's like preaching. Well, that's gonna come in the next chapter. Like the next chapter is like parable. But it seems to me like what's happening here is you're getting kind of a summary of like the first part of Jesus's ministry, right?
His first tool.
Yeah, he's going around, he's doing all this stuff. He's getting such big crowds that he's not they're coming on, they're like, there's too many that they're having to go to the sea. And he's also dealing with this issue, right, of the demons, But like that's kind of a rehash of stuff that we've already talked about. But it really seems to me that that's actually kind of an intro to the next section on the 12 apostles. And it seems that like that what it probably is that like the 12 apostles are like officially talked about here because they are like an answer to those problems before, right? They're an answer to those problems of crowding. They're the ones that go, right? Because it says his disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd, right? He's now starting to utilize his disciples to help do crowd management stuff, right? Because they're becoming a problem. Like his fame is becoming a problem, which is a thing that he knew was going to happen, and so he's trying to control his level of fame. And so like there's kind of just a little bit of like practical wisdom in there with just like standard ministry stuff of like whatever it is that you're doing. Like if crowds are getting like so big that in like you're becoming popular, step away. like step away and manage the crowd, right? And again, because it's the same thing that like even Brooke talked about like a couple weeks ago, where it's like, and we've talked about in this where people are coming to him for those miracles, right? They're coming to him for those things, and he's like, that's not the goal. That's not where I'm trying to get I'm trying to get the message out. The message getting out is the thing that's important, not me performing miracles for individual people here and there. And so that leads us to the next part.
And he went up on the mountain and called to him those whom he desired, and they came to him. And he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach and have authority to cast out demons. He appointed the 12.
All right, we're gonna pause it right there because I want to spend a little bit more time on the list in a bit. And he went up on the mountain. I wanted to look this up more, but I think there is some. I think this is one of Michael Heiser's big things, is that he thinks that this mountain, I think this is it, because of where he's situated, that this mountain might be like, I don't know if this is the one where he tries to connect it to Mount Hermon, but I can't remember. But he's up north. But other people are like, probably. Some commentators were like, it probably isn't an actual mountain; it's probably just a hill around Capernaum. But I wanted to point out that he sent them out to do what? To preach and have the authority to cast out demons. And so he's primarily sending them out to preach, but they also have the authority to cast out demons. And the authority question is the big deal, right? Because right, we already have the new person teaching with authority. What is he like? Where does that come from? Who is he? But also he has the ability to give out authority, which is different, right? And so if he has the authority to give that out, that implies that, right, that if he has the authority to cast them out and he has the authority to give them out, it implies that he is like the head of this this thing of whatever's going on. And eventually get the right. All of this is meant to pose the question of like, who can have this authority, right? Because like we said, the running theme of the book of Mark is, who is this guy? Why does he have that? Like who is Jesus, right? So now the list.
Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder, Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, and James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Then he went.
Okay. So if you remember from a couple of weeks ago, there should be a glaring issue in this disciples list? Can anybody figure out what it is? You can go back and look at chapter 2 as a hint.
I think Diego's right. There isn't a Levi.
There isn't a Levi,
But there is a son of Alphaeus.
but there is a son of Alphaeus. All right, so that's what we're going to talk about, right? And whenever I talked about this, right, if you remember, who did I say Levi was? Matthew. But maybe I mentioned this. I also said that there are some people that think that he was James. And why did I say that? I didn't know this at the time because I didn't pay enough attention. But as soon as I read this, I was like, oh, that's why some people think that Levi is the same.
Your own homework.
Yeah, I didn't do my own homework good enough a couple weeks ago. My mistake. But it's that. But it's that. And I like looked it up today, like to find out more about it. And I was like, okay, does this James, son of Alphaeus, like is that Levi? And pretty much everybody agrees that no, it's not. So a couple of theories are that one, they might have been brothers.
Why don't they get a cool name like
Bo and Energy. So we'll talk about that here in a minute too. But there's something kind of interesting going on. So how do we know that, or why do we think that Levi is Matthew? Well, the reason why is because in all three synoptic gospels, there's the story of Jesus calling the tax collector. In Mark, the tax collector's name is Levi. In Luke, the tax collector's name is Levi. In Matthew, the tax collector's name is Matthew. So in the book of Matthew is actually the only book where the tax collector is called Matthew. And it's one of the things where, so you'll find like more critical scholar types are like, oh, this just shows that like the books are unreliable and blah, 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 blah. But it's really interesting if you look at early church fathers on this, because the early church fathers think that something very intentional is going on there. It was very common at the time for people to have, especially Jews, to have both a Hebrew name and a Greek name. It's very similar to like if Asian people move here, where they'll have like an American name. Like I was friends with foreign exchange students in college, and they'd be like, my name is like, I had one that was like, my name is Kevin. It's like his real name wasn't Kevin, like, right? And it was super, super common. But the thing is that there was also, you got to remember at the time, there was a lot of tension between Hellenized Jews and like, I guess I don't have a word for this, like native Jews, right? Like Jews in Israel. And so there was this and so if you remember why people hated tax collectors, right? Because tax collectors were seen as betrayers to their own people, right? Because what they were is they were native people who could speak the language, who would go to Rome and say, hey, I can make sure that you get such and such bottom line for taxes. And they would go, okay, cool. You get the tax contract, go make it happen. And you have the authority of the Roman backing. So if you need any of our soldiers, you let us know. So the tax collector would go around, and he would then tell people, you need to pay me this amount. Usually it was a higher amount than he needed to collect because he was trying to get money for himself. And so he would say, you need to pay me this amount. And if you don't, I'm going to go get the Romans to bring their soldiers over here and beat you up until you do pay your money, right? And so because of this, everybody hated tax collectors, right? Because they were seen as betrayers, basically working for the enemy. Part of the way that this connection was made is by referring to people as their Greek name. if you called someone by their Greek name, you are strengthening that tie that they have to the Roman and like which is by extension like the Greek state, like that wider world outside. This tension is seen even within like the list here and the disciples, right? Because you have you have Matthew, but you also have at the bottom Simon the Zealot. Who were the Zealots? The Zealots were the people that literally wanted to rebel and like kill all of the Romans and get them out, right? And so Jesus is bringing people in from all corners, all sides. And what's happening is, and this isn't an interpretation. So I don't know if I can. Oh no, I have it right here. So this is an interpretation from some of the early church fathers. So this is from Jerome. Out of respect and deference, the other evangelists were unwilling to call him by the common name of Matthew, but instead Levi. Matthew would have been the Greek name, and Levi would have been his Hebrew name. So Matthew went by a double name in accordance with what Solomon noted. An accuser is righteous at the beginning of his words, and in another place, tell your sins and you will be justified. Matthew also calls himself a publican to show his readers that no one must despair of the salvation that has changed for the better, for he was suddenly changed from a publican to an apostle. So what he's saying is the reason why their theory, the early church fathers' theory for why it was like this, is that Matthew uses his Greek name in the text to not hide the fact that he was siding with Rome. He is not trying to hide that fact. But his friends who are writing the other gospels are not trying to out him. So when they tell that story about when he's called, to soften the blow, they use his Hebrew name to kind of let people know he's calling a Hebrew. And so like he was still on our side. And so Jesus was like kind of able to like bring him back. Because remember, from all of their perspective, like he's this terrible person.
So then why would Matthew himself write his gospel?
And the point is because of
title it with his Greek name.
Well, remember, he didn't pick the title. The titles of the names, none of the titles of the gospels are written there by the original authors. That's what the church referred to them later on and attributed those names to them.
So then why did the church choose it?
Because in that book, he calls himself Matthew. And so they're maintaining that, like, that's what it is.
I would argue they're trying to pander, actually.
Possibly.
Like
Right. There's
like, hey, you call the Greek guy too.
like we don't fully know, and also like there.
Old Matt down the street could have wrote that book.
Yeah, so like we don't always know why the church settled on like certain names for certain things.
That's interesting.
But that was the take of a lot of the early church fathers.
It definitely resulted in a lot more babies in the resulting millennia being named Matthew and not Levi.
Yeah. But I also think that it's interesting because I think that there's definitely something kind of like hidden going on that they're not that the gospel is not trying to like fully explain. And so it makes sense that there would be something like that because right, we've talked a lot, especially as we went through Genesis. It was very common for like editors to write like little things to like give a little bit of clarity to like what's going on in a certain situation. And there are those instances that I believe show up in the New Testaments, and like I think we'll get to some of those in some later chapters. I don't remember, but there are different parts where like so like there'll be a part like there's one part in one of the gospels, I think it's in Mark, I can't remember, but like Jesus has like this big long thing, and in the middle of it cuts, and there's literally a parenthetical statement that says like no one should change the word of God into parentheses, and like it keeps going. And it's like, why did someone write that? I doubt Jesus, like in the middle of, first of all, it's not in like red lettering. It's like it's in like, it's like in white text. And because people are like, oh, this is like the author probably like saying this. Well, what's probably going on is that they probably originally had this big thing, but the teaching is very weird and it's very strange. And so the editors were probably like, okay, we're having a lot of like monks and people that are copying this down that really want to change this section because we don't get it and we don't understand it. And we need to let them know, stop trying to change the stupid thing. That's what it says. Leave it. And so they put this little thing right there that says, don't change the word of God. It doesn't matter that we don't understand it. We're going to leave it, gosh darn it. And we're going to go on. And it's like, that makes sense to me, is like why it's there. But if editors are willing to do it, how come nobody came along in these other gospels and ever wrote like additions to it that were like, hey, by the way, Levi is Matthew, but like this is his like Hebrew name, and like blah blah blah. There you go on. It seems to me that like the early church was like conscious of the fact that like the writers were trying to do something here, and we need to respect it, and we probably shouldn't like call it out. We'll just leave it and assume that they were right, and we're gonna like go on, because it's very obvious. Like they're one chapter apart, so it's like, why would you have this discrepancy? I think it's always best to assume that the writer isn't an idiot and just like making stuff up. It's like they have a reason for what's going on. We just don't know what it is.
So why does Jesus decide to rename Simon with the Greek name, and how many of these are Greek, and
and how many of them are Hebrew?
Yeah, like
Yeah.
Philippos, I'm guessing was originally a Greek name.
Yes.
Petros, I'm guessing, was originally a Greek name.
So like a couple of them are like interesting. So like Bartholomew is probably the Greek name for Nathan. So like in John, Philip goes and gets Nathan, and just so you understand, these aren't like translations, right? So it's not like there's a translation between like one and the other. It's that people are just picking different names, and part of this threw me for a while because I know what the Hebrew name for Matthew is. It's Matisyahu, because that's what Matisyahu's name is, who I listen to all the time. Like that's the Hebrew version of the name Matthew. And so it's not like it's it's not a translation. It's literally they're different names and they pick them. Why do they pick them? You'd have to go talk to like the people, right? Same thing with what I said earlier about like the guy that I knew in college that his name was Kevin. His regular name was like Son Wu or something like that.
And I guess
like,
what I'm saying is why when Jesus is like, all right, we got two Simons here, so one of you, I'm going to give you a Greek. I'm going to give you a new name. I'm going to call you something else, and it's going to be Greek.
and it's going to be great.
So
So
that maybe already his Greek name.
Again, we
Is that
don't.
something that no one really talked about.
We do, I don't think we necessarily know, and also we don't.
Just trying to make his pals look bad, maybe.
Well, we also don't necessarily know like.
What's the Hebrew word for rock?
Well, and also we don't like, because a lot of people are thinking that Jesus is speaking in Aramaic, right? So you have that issue too.
I withdraw my question.
And so we don't necessarily.
Two languages.
Yeah, so we don't necessarily know, like, okay, what is he actually calling them? But the writer, and this is where we just kind of have to trust that the writers, as they are translating the languages, that they know better than we know, that they have a rationale for choosing the names that they do. So the Sons of Thunder line, again, this is a nickname that gets mentioned multiple times. Nobody really knows where it's from. I got this from.
Jesus just thought these guys are really cool. Coolest guys in history.
Mike Winger, the theory that I heard from him, which maybe he picked up from someone else, which I think is funny, is I guess there was a story in one of the other gospels about how there was like a town that like did something wrong, and it's listed that it was James and John went up and asked Jesus, should we call fire down upon them? and like Jesus is like, no. and so it's probably like his theory is that it's probably a joke about that they were like really zealous and like, yeah, let's go like just like start like cursing people like left and right. And he just like, nah, man, chill out. Like it's cool. And like calls them sons of thunder because they're just like loud and boisterous. And he even has a point, which I think is probably apt too, which is that it also just goes to show probably the change in them, because by the time that like tradition holds that James is like, well, pretty much all of them are like martyred. James eventually like gives his life down, right? So he goes from like, he makes his point about he goes from a person that's like wanting to call down like fire and brimstone upon people to like being like, okay, I'm willing to give my life for like the gospel. And then like John is called like the beloved disciple, and like he writes all of these texts that are constantly like, you need to show love for people, you need to show love for people, you need to show love for people. And so like it there's also probably a little bit of a right, kind of like a lot of the other things that I just said about like Levi. Like this is the thing that like they're the disciples are the best quality of the disciples is like their willingness to like admit their own faults. And it's like, you got to remember, it's like the disciples and the people that followed them are the ones that wrote these texts, and like they're constantly like writing and displaying their own like shortcomings and their own like how dumb they were, and like they're constantly like, just like, man, we were really dumb here. like we did this really bad thing. And it seems to me like that's what a lot of like that kind of stuff is. There's also a lot about I'll skip that because I want to try and finish this chapter. So are you guys all right with that? We'll try going a little bit longer in exchange for finishing the chapter.
Home, and the crowd gathered again, so that they could not even eat. And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, he is out of his mind.
Okay, Jesus' family thinks that he's crazy because of what he's doing and the things that he's claiming and all of his fame. And also, this probably shows that like he's not living with them at this time, right? Because shouldn't they have like heard about the things that were going on right away? No, they're probably living still back in Nazareth, right? Whereas he is not there. And so when they heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying he is out of his mind. And to me, again, disciples willing to admit their faults. This to me is probably Jesus's family, probably namely his brother James, who's going to become a leader in the church later, displaying his willingness to admit his own faults and where he was wrong. But yeah, so we're going to keep going.
The scribes who came down from Jerusalem were saying, he is possessed by Beelzebul, and by the prince of demons he casts out the demons. And he called them to him and said to them in parables, how can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but is coming to an end. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man. Then indeed he may plunder his house. Truly I say to you, all sins will be forgiven the children of man, and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. For they were saying, he has an unclean spirit.
Okay, so I know this is a big section and we could talk about this like forever. So a couple things that I want to point out. the scribes who came down from Jerusalem, right? So it's come down, by the way. Like I always think of whenever people say come down like that, they're like going from north to south, but they're going from Jerusalem up to Galilee. And so that always like throws me. But you got to remember, there's an elevation thing here. Galilee is actually like really low. Actually, apparently the Sea of Galilee is like one of the second lowest points on Earth, behind like the Dead Sea or something like that. So it's really low. So they're going down from Jerusalem. He is possessed by Beelzebub. The name Beelzebub has like connotations that are connected to Baal in like the Old Testament, and so they're like names that are connected there. And by the prince of demons, he casts out demons. So okay, so this shows you what I was talking about earlier about like this question of authority that's going on like with Jesus, that's going on with the big meta question about who Jesus is, but this question of like, okay, sure, we know that he can do all of these things, but by what authority is he doing them? And so it's not super special that he's doing miracles. We need to know what authority he's doing them by. It's then interesting to me how Jesus connects the name Satan and Beelzebub together, right? And so Jesus is the one that's kind of tying it, because Jesus is kind of tying in these like these ideas of like the top of like a hierarchical order of like demons that's Satan, right? And so Jesus is the one that's tying these names together. But then I want to spend most of our time on the parable itself. So the first part is pretty self-explanatory, right? Where are the things that okay.
I know. I was saying that's a young Abe Lincoln was so inspired.
So Jesus also has a couple of like presuppositions. So
Jesus
one,
time traveling abilities, to quote Abe Lincoln.
I have no idea what you guys are talking about. But Jesus infers that Satan. So these are things that like would have been like kind of debates at the time, and also are kind of even like debates today. But he infers that Satan has a kingdom, or at least operates like one, that he's like the head of. He also infers that Satan is not dumb, right? That's what his thing of how can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand, right? He's giving practical advice for saying, your accusation of me doesn't make any sense because Satan isn't an idiot. If Satan was going against himself, like his kingdom would fall, right? And Jesus is making a couple of assumptions about how the supernatural powers of darkness function. He's assuming that they function in a hierarchical system. He's assuming that they function like a kingdom, and he's assuming that they are not dumb. Okay. Then he says, and if Satan has written, but this part here, okay. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man. Then indeed he may plunder his house. Question for you guys: who is the strong man?
We're doing is Samson strong man?
I mean, in Jesus' parable here, where he says, right, he goes from, and if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but is coming to an end. Next sentence, but no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man, then indeed he may plunder his house. Who is the strong man? Satan. It's very easy to think that the strong man is like God or Jesus, because we're like, oh yeah, God and Jesus, like they're super strong. But the point of what he's saying here is that the strong man is Satan, and what he is doing is that he is coming in here and binding that strong man so that he, Jesus, can then plunder his house, right? And also, we can see this because if you go back up a little bit, and if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. Whose house is he talking about? He's talking about Satan's house. He's talking about Satan's realm. And so the house at the later part of it is also going to be Satan's house. Right? That's the way that you should read it. That's the way that makes sense of what Jesus is trying to say.
Well, what is there to be plundered in Satan's house? Just-
People.
Oh, okay.
That's what he's doing.
Taking them.
Right? Because what is this in relationship to? This is in relationship to casting out demons. And so his point is that what he's doing by casting out demons is he's going into the strong man's house and he is binding them so that he can take his plunder, which is people. That's what Jesus is doing. And right, and if you remember how I talked about what the word gospel meant at the beginning, about how gospel was used in their context, where it was, I'm the king, you need to get in line or else I'm going to take you out. That's what Jesus is saying, but he's saying it on a spiritual level, and he's saying it to the supernatural powers of darkness, and he's displaying that by casting out demons and basically spiritually kicking their butt. And then he says it again right here, this is what I'm doing, right? What I'm doing is I'm coming into the strong man's house and I'm binding him so that I can take his plunder, which is people. Does that make sense? And then you get this bit about, truly I say to you, all sins will be forgiven the children of man, and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemies against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. For they were saying he has an unclean spirit. So people talk about the unforgivable sin a lot. I've taught on it as a theologian's thing. I won't go into like all the details on it. So I'll just say this of the way that I feel you should read and interpret this section. So this is what it is. It's the religious leaders, right? Remember, it's scribes from Jerusalem. They're coming and talking to him. It's the religious leaders who should know better, saying that something that is clearly of God, his ability to heal and cast out demons, that is actually the work of the devil. It's all of those things together. That is what is unforgivable. The reason for this seems obvious to me because as a leader of the church, you are judged more harshly for what you teach. And if you see something that is of God and you know that it is of God, but you say that it is satanic specifically for the purposes of your own gain, then you are abusing your position for your own personal gain, and that is and status, right? Like, and this is how I was talking about, like, it relates to even what happened earlier in the chapter, right? That is unforgivable because you are trying to subvert God's own authority from within God's house, right? And so it's like it's exactly what I said earlier. You're taking the thing that God meant to be used as his tool to redeem the world, and you are using it in such a way to bring your own personal gain and saying that something that is godly is satanic. To me, the closest and so for me, I personally think that it's pretty obvious that this is a sin that I think most people just like can't commit, just because
That's the only part I remember you saying.
yeah, the vast majority of people aren't even in a position where they could commit a sin like this. There was a fad a number of years ago on YouTube where people would record themselves where they were atheists, and they'd be like, "I blaspheme against the Holy Spirit. There, I'm now unforgivable. Stop trying to evangelize to me." And they'd like upload it to YouTube, and I was like, "You're the dumbest people." That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Right? It would be like making a video and just saying like, I commit adultery. It's as dumb as the freaking Office thing where he walks in and goes, I declare bankruptcy. It's like, no, that's not how this works. That's not what it is. You don't know what you're talking about. And so when people do that, they're just displaying that they don't know what they're talking about. And this is a sin that can really only be committed by people that know what they're talking about, that know what they're doing. And to me, I think that actually, so for a modern day example of this, I actually think that, like, if you look at someone like John MacArthur, I don't know that this is what he's doing because I'm not in a position to know, right? God's the only one that can really judge this. But whenever someone like John MacArthur, who's like a well-studied, like popular guy, comes out and says something like, speaking in tongues is satanic and of the devil, I'm like, that's as closest to like someone committing the unforgivable sin as I can like possibly imagine. And it's like, you should know better. Like be careful. And so I have a real hard time whenever people want to like say that some other like Christian group or whatever is heretical or satanic or whatever and all this stuff. It's like, okay, give people some grace and like also understand that like you're not the one that gets to make that judgment, right? So I'll just say that. But I think it's clear to me that that's where it's going on. And also I just want to highlight it because it literally says, for they were saying he has an unclean spirit. So like that right there, that last little sentence, it's like, that is the qualifier for what the unforgivable sin is. For they, the scribes, the leaders, were saying he, Jesus, who like has the power of the Holy Spirit, he has an unclean spirit. Like that right there, it needs to be all of those things together. And it also is important to note that it's not just generic blasphemies, right? Like people can commit blasphemy like all they want, and blasphemy basically is just things that are wrong about God, right? Like it's blasphemous to say that Jesus isn't God. All right, people can go around and say Jesus isn't God all they want, blah 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 blah. God can forgive that, no problem. He's like, okay, get your act in order. Like, all right. And the reason why that he can't forgive or can't or won't forgive the other one is because you were already in a position that you were forgiven and that you knew, right? It's like, it's actually very similar to me for the question of why is there no redemption plan for angels, right? There's a plan of redemption for humans, but there's no plan of redemption for angels. We don't have a clear understanding why, but it seems to me that the reason why is because angels are in a privileged position that human beings are not in, where they can see the full glory of God and they know God is God, God is good, God is sovereign, he's the one in charge. We need to align our will with God. And if they reject him, he's like, okay, there's no like there's nothing else I can do, right? I've displayed my fullness to you and you rejected it. Okay. And so what's going on here in the unforgivable sins? Like, you're a person that's had that same thing.
So that's actually a really great point because him saying this is coming just after them basically accusing him of being Satan.
Yes.
And then therefore his conclusion of his little dialogue there is that, oh, by the way, this is why God's not going to forgive Satan.
Yes.
Which I've never heard that.
Yeah. They're very much like connected rationales for why that's going on.
Because I've never ever been told why Satan can't be forgiven. I mean, I always assumed that it was out of the question. I was never really.
Well, the thing is that it is out of the question. Like whenever I say that, right, we don't have a clear biblical rationale for why it's out of the question. We just know that it is out of the question, right? It doesn't show up anywhere.
Satan like genuinely hates God and just wouldn't like I feel, and obviously this wouldn't make any sense because it's against who like Satan kind of is. But like if for some reason Satan was sorry, I feel like it would almost be plausible that he could be. But the whole point of Satan is like he hates God and he doesn't care that he's damned for eternity. He's fine with going down if it means that he can do anything against God. And so like because of that, that's like why he's not able to be forgiven. But maybe I'm wrong.
I mean, sure.
You have your own reasons, that's cool.
Yeah, again, like we're in speculation territory,
Yeah.
no matter what we do. So yeah. So let's try and finish this up real quick.
And his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, "Your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you." And he answered them, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking about at those who sat around him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother."
So
And all the Catholics said, but Jesus, that's the Virgin Mary.
yeah,
the
yeah,
Holy
yeah,
Mary.
yeah, that's the Theotokos.
That's your
yeah,
actual mom.
yeah.
Jesus
Um,
way to just avoid Spain.
Yeah. And it's actually
the Thanksgiving.
it's actually really so it's funny because it seems very clear, like it seems very clear that Jesus is calling out his family in this passage, right?
This is the Friendsgiving.
But like if you actually, like, to Evan's point, if you go look at like Catholic like interpretations of this like section and be like, is Jesus calling out his family, like and saying that like did he kind of like say like you guys did something wrong, and that like that included like Mary, like did Jesus really get mad at his mom? They'll be like, oh no, that's not what it was. He was just making a theological point about how all of the people around him are his family and just as important. But Jesus like always cared about is like, yeah, Jesus did care about his mom, but Jesus is also very clearly calling out his mom because 10 verses up, they said he was crazy, right? It's very clear that like that idea is like connected, that this whole thing, like this whole chapter and all this stuff is about the various forms of opposition that Jesus faced, right? Like that's all what this chapter is various forms of opposition, and his family serves as one of those forms of opposition that comes up against him. And so it's thrown in here at the end where he's like, he like Jesus was forced to even go against his own family to do it, which is why later on, whenever he tells you, hey, there's going to be times where you need to go against your own family because you need to follow after the will of God, he's calling you to something that he himself had to like go through.
I would even say also very specifically that his mom was getting called out because on a generic theological term, like sure, brothers and sisters, that's just thrown around like crazy in the Bible, but like the specific inclusion of and mother, like thrown in there, like no, that one is definitely not like common. Like, oh, we're all like the brothers and sisters and mothers of God. It's like no, we don't say that.
No. But also to that point, I want to actually draw a couple things from that too. Is one, remember the same things that I said about the disciples, right? Also, in applying to James and his family, also applies to his mom here too. That I think one of the things that you can very much say about Mary is that, and I see this in like, you can sense this in like all the Gospels, is that Mary seems like she was very humble and willing to admit where she was wrong too in certain places, and there are places where Mary like it's stories that like that the disciples could have only gotten from Mary, and like so Mary, like it shows that like Mary went through a progression and a change over time for how she thought about Jesus and who he was at the beginning, right? Because, and again, we're doing the thing that I said not to do, which is melding gospels here a bit. But it's like
Classes.
Jesus, like Mary knew that Jesus was significant, but she didn't know how,
Right.
and she didn't understand really what it meant, and so much so that she like later on is like willing to admit, I got it wrong, and I thought my son was going crazy.
Well, I'm even willing to be even more charitable to Mary than that, and say that okay, maybe you could as good of a motive as you can attribute to why she's here. The very fact that she is here is saying that at bare minimum, whatever motivation, she wants Jesus to stop doing his ministry the way he's doing it.
Yes.
And by that very fact, she's going against the will of God, and it's part of the reason why Jesus is saying this here. You can even be very charitable to Mary and say, oh, Mary's just doing this because she has a genuine care for her son and doesn't like all the attention he's getting. You can do all that, and I know all that's extra biblical. It's not stated.
Well, there's a second point that I want to make with this thing. That's kind of you can figure out a lot by what's not said, right? Which is that who is not mentioned here? The dad. Joseph isn't mentioned here, right? And that's I think that is super significant, and it's one of the things that again, kind of like what I mentioned with the Levi thing. There's a lot of times where like a lot can be said by what's not said, and the fact of how much like Joseph gets mentioned in like the birth narratives, and then he's just not mentioned later, to me very clearly indicates that Joseph is dead by the point of when most of the gospel narratives are occurring. And so because of that, Jesus as the firstborn is sort of supposed to be the head of the household, right? And so it is also probably part of what is going on is that the family might just be pissed at him because he's not at home, right? And man, this is why I have like a whole like fanfic like play thing in my head that is the conversation between, because we don't have this story of how Jesus' brother James actually like converted. And so like to me, it's probably a lot of this stuff is like also like from James, and James is probably really ticked at Jesus because probably James is the one that got like saddled with all of the responsibilities at home, and like had to take care of everything, had to take care of all of his brothers and sisters, had to take care of his mom and like all this stuff. And it also comes to another weird point of whenever you get to John's gospel and you have the line where Jesus says to Mary, behold your son, and basically puts John the disciple kind of in charge of Mary, at least for a time, right? He passes Mary off to the disciple John. That probably shows that at the time of Jesus's death, he wasn't on very good terms with his brother, right? That's pretty like intense. But also to know that afterwards, James becomes the bishop in Jerusalem. It's like, okay, and also I believe there's the line that Paul makes where he says that he appeared to the 12 and to James. And so it's like, we have some indication that James had an appearance like Paul did of the risen Christ, where Christ came to him specifically, but we have no idea what that conversation was. And I just think that is super fascinating, because it's like, that's a conversation where God is convincing you that he's your brother and like you've known him your whole life, and like you were pissed at him for like a large portions of it. Like that's a weird conversation. And it also makes total sense to me that it's not included in the Bible, because it's probably a lot of James calling out Jesus for like you should have been here and you should have been here and
Yeah,
blah 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 blah
well,
blah
'cause
blah.
it- 'cause
And
it's like- it's
and
like the-
Jesus being like, I had more important things to do, bro.
Right.
Like,
God.
look at this.
Right.
Look at this.
Because James is like, and James is an individual, probably the person that, like, because of this whole plan, is like probably the one person to which Jesus' actions are like the most unfair, right?
I think
Potentially.
the retort was, I'm sorry, whoever does the will of God is mine.
It's like, oh,
I know
slam.
what?
Yeah, no. And so like there's all of those dynamics that are like going on like behind the scenes that just seem like very evident to me. It's also one of the things that like it's also one of the things where like this comes up with a lot of the I've talked about it some about like Jesus was probably like considered a bastard, right, by like the people that were around, because like this is why you have like the story about like the kid's not supposed to be able to like disciples are like, oh, we're gonna keep the kids going, and he's like, no, like it's fine. And like and so like there was like all of that stuff there. But I'm done for the chapter. Sorry that went a little bit long. Any lingering questions, comments, concerns? We'll be spending a bunch of time in parables next week. So, all right.